Hey guys, tonight we begin with Aztec priests and their rather intense morning routine. And by intense, I mean they literally had people's hearts in their hands before most of us have even had our first cup of coffee. If you think your job has high stakes, wait until you hear about these guys who couldn't afford to have an off day because, well, the sun might not rise tomorrow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into the world of Mesoamerican religious dedication that makes modern workplace stress look like a spa day. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Aztec human sacrifice. Most people picture wild, bloodthirsty savages randomly grabbing people and going to town with obsidian knives like some kind of ancient horror movie. In reality, Aztec sacrifice was more like the world's most elaborate, religiously mandated medical procedure performed by highly trained professionals who spent decades learning their craft. Think of it less like a medieval execution and more like open heart surgery, except the patient was definitely not surviving and the goal wasn't healing, but keeping the universe from literally falling apart. These weren't chaotic blood orgies. They were carefully choreographed religious ceremonies with more preparation, ritual purification, and precise timing than a NASA launch. The priests involved were essentially the neurosurgeons of the spiritual world, except instead of saving lives, they were saving existence itself from cosmic collapse. 15th century Mesoamerica wasn't some primitive backwater. It was home to one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth, with cities that would make European capitals look like village markets. Tenochtitlan wasn't just impressive. For its time, it was a marvel that left Spanish conquistadors literally speechless, describing floating gardens, massive pyramids, and urban planning that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The Aztec priests controlled not just religious life, but education, astronomy, medicine, and basically every aspect of intellectual pursuit in their empire. If you thought these guys were just wielding knives and chanting, think again. They were mathematicians who calculated celestial movements with stunning accuracy, doctors who performed successful skull surgeries, and architects who built structures that are still standing today. They maintained vast libraries of codices, ran schools that would put modern universities to shame, and operated a bureaucracy so complex it made the Roman Empire look like a corner store operation. But here's where it gets interesting. Their entire worldview was built on the belief that the universe was fundamentally unstable. Unlike our modern assumption that the world will keep spinning without our help, Aztecs believed that existence itself required constant maintenance. The sun needed daily encouragement to rise. The earth needed regular feeding to stay fertile. And the gods needed continuous payment to keep the cosmic machinery running. It was like living in a universe held together with spiritual duct tape. And if you stopped applying fresh strips, everything would fall apart. This wasn't superstition to them. It was cosmic engineering, and human sacrifice was their primary tool for keeping reality functioning. Enter Tlacelol, possibly the most influential person you've never heard of, who basically turned Aztec sacrifice from occasional religious observance into industrial-scale cosmic maintenance. This guy wasn't technically an emperor, but he pulled strings behind the throne for decades, transforming Aztec society into what we might recognize today as a theocratic military-industrial complex. Except instead of building tanks, they were building pyramids and perfecting heart extraction techniques. Tlacelol looked at traditional Aztec religion and thought, you know what this needs? More war, more sacrifice, and definitely more dramatic flair. He essentially convinced an entire civilization that their daily survival depended on regular offerings of human hearts to the sun god. But here's the twist. Modern historians suspect he knew exactly what he was doing from a political standpoint. Nothing unifies a population quite like the shared belief that your neighbors want to literally end the world by stopping the sacrifices. Under his influence, what started as occasional religious ceremonies became daily requirements. The priests went from part-time spiritual advisors to full-time cosmic engineers working around the clock to keep existence functioning. Tlacaelel turned sacrifice into both foreign policy and domestic policy. It justified constant warfare to capture victims, maintained social control through fear of cosmic collapse, and kept the priestly class essential and powerful. And if you think that's politically calculated, wait until you hear about how these priests actually prepared for these ceremonies. The level of preparation, training, and ritual purification involved makes modern surgical protocols look casual. We're talking about years of education, months of specific preparation for individual ceremonies, and daily routines that would exhaust a professional athlete. This wasn't just about appeasing angry gods or maintaining social control through fear. The Aztec sacrifice system was the foundation of their entire worldview, legal system, international relations, and daily life. Every aspect of Aztec society revolved around the belief that human sacrifice was literally preventing the apocalypse on a daily basis. The priests responsible for these ceremonies weren't just religious officials. They were the guardians of existence itself, at least in their minds. A mistake during a sacrifice wasn't just embarrassing. It could theoretically end the world. The pressure on these individuals was astronomical. Modern air traffic controllers, surgeons, and nuclear power plant operators have stressful jobs. But none of them wake up thinking that if they mess up today, the sun might not rise tomorrow. The complexity of their preparation rituals reflected these stakes. We're talking about elaborate purification ceremonies, specific dietary requirements, detailed astronomical calculations, and training regimens that lasted for years. The social, political, and spiritual consequences of getting it wrong were so severe that Aztec priests developed preparation protocols that make modern military special forces training look relaxed. But Tlacaelel, his political maneuvering, was just the beginning of this story. The real fascination lies in how ordinary people transformed themselves into the cosmic mechanics of the universe. Let's dive into what it actually took to become an Aztec priest and prepare for these world-saving procedures. Becoming an Aztec priest wasn't like deciding to join the clergy after a midlife crisis. It was more like getting accepted into an extremely exclusive graduate program where the final exam involved literally holding someone's beating heart. Unlike our modern assumption that ancient religious training was just memorizing prayers and looking solemn, Aztec priestly education was basically a decades-long boot camp that combined medical school, astronomy PhD, theology doctorate, and Navy SEAL training into one terrifying package. The process typically began when boys were around 6 years old, selected either because their parents were devoutly religious, politically ambitious, or had simply run out of other career options for their kid. These weren't random selections. Families carefully considered whether their child had the stomach for a profession that required both incredible intellectual rigor and the ability to perform heart surgery on conscious patients without flinching. Training schools, called Kalmakak, were like ancient boarding schools designed by someone who thought regular boarding schools weren't nearly strict enough. We're talking about institutions where students woke up at 4 a.m. for cold baths, spent their days studying complex astronomical calculations, learning to read and write in multiple languages, memorizing thousands of religious songs, and practicing surgical techniques on animals. And that was just the easy part. What made this training unique wasn't just its intensity. It was the combination of intellectual and physical demands. These future priests had to master mathematics sophisticated enough to predict eclipses, memorize religious texts longer than the entire Bible, develop the steady hands necessary for precision surgery, and build the emotional detachment required to kill people regularly while maintaining genuine religious devotion. It was like training someone to be simultaneously a rocket scientist, a cardiac surgeon, and a deeply spiritual person who could end lives without losing their faith. The historical reality was that most students didn't make it through the full program. The dropout rate was astronomical, and not just because the curriculum was difficult. The psychological demands of the profession meant that many promising students discovered they simply didn't have the mental fortitude required to spend their adult lives performing human sacrifice while genuinely believing they were saving the world. Those who did complete the training emerged as some of the most educated, disciplined, and psychologically complex individuals in their society. Take the case of a typical priestly student we'll call Itzel, not his real name, obviously, since individual student records didn't survive the Spanish conquest. But based on archaeological evidence and Spanish colonial accounts, we can reconstruct what his training would have looked like. Itzel's day began at 4 a.m., with ritual purification that made modern athletic warm-ups look casual. He would bathe in cold water regardless of weather, perform specific breathing exercises designed to center his mind, and spend an hour in meditation focused on preparing himself mentally for the day's tasks. This wasn't just spiritual preparation. It was psychological conditioning designed to help him maintain emotional stability, while performing extremely stressful procedures that his morning classes covered what we might recognize today as advanced mathematics and astronomy. Aztec priests had to be able to calculate the exact timing of religious ceremonies based on complex astronomical observations. They needed to predict eclipses, track the movements of Venus, and coordinate multiple overlapping calendar systems with precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. One Spanish chronicler allegedly wrote that these priests could predict celestial events with accuracy that impressed even trained European astronomers. Afternoons were dedicated to what we might euphemistically call practical training. Students practiced surgical techniques on animals, learning to make precise incisions with obsidian blades that were sharper than modern surgical steel. They studied human anatomy in detail that would rival medical school curricula, memorizing the exact location of major organs, understanding blood flow patterns, and developing the manual dexterity necessary to perform heart extraction quickly and efficiently. But perhaps most challenging was the psychological training. Students were gradually exposed to increasing levels of violence and death, starting with animal sacrifices and slowly working up to observing human ceremonies. They were taught meditation techniques designed to maintain emotional detachment during traumatic procedures, and they practiced maintaining religious focus while performing actions that would traumatize most people. One particularly intense training exercise involved students spending entire nights alone in caves or on mountain peaks, fasting and meditating while contemplating their future responsibilities. These weren't casual camping trips. They were designed to test psychological resilience and spiritual commitment under extreme conditions. Students who couldn't handle these solo trials were quietly redirected toward other career paths. The linguistic requirements alone were staggering. Priests needed to memorize thousands of religious songs, prayers, and ceremonial instructions in multiple languages and dialects. They had to master complex poetic forms used in religious ceremonies, understand the symbolic meaning of hundreds of different ritual elements, and be able to perform lengthy ceremonies entirely from memory without missing a single word or gesture. Advanced students practiced on condemned criminals, learning to perform sacrifice procedures under supervision while maintaining the proper religious mindset. These weren't just execution practice sessions. They were complex religious ceremonies that required perfect timing, precise ritual movements, and genuine spiritual focus. A student who could perform the physical procedures but couldn't maintain the proper religious attitude was considered a failure, regardless of their technical skill level. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing involving human psychology and religious belief ever is. The contradiction at the heart of Aztec priestly training was that they were simultaneously being taught to value human life as the most precious offering to the gods, while also being conditioned to end that life regularly and efficiently. Modern psychological research suggests that this type of cognitive dissonance should have been impossible to maintain long-term. Yet Aztec priests managed to function for generations within this system. They genuinely believed that sacrifice was an act of love and devotion, not violence and cruelty. From their perspective, they weren't killing people. They were helping souls achieve the highest possible spiritual destiny while simultaneously saving the entire universe from destruction. This created complex psychological profiles that Spanish chroniclers struggled to understand. These same priests who could expertly extract a human heart would spend hours tenderly caring for injured animals, demonstrate profound compassion for suffering community members, and show genuine grief when natural disasters struck their cities. They weren't psychopaths or sadists. They were deeply religious individuals who had been trained to compartmentalize their actions within a specific spiritual framework. Archaeological evidence reveals another contradiction in their training. While they were being prepared for what we would consider extreme violence, they were simultaneously receiving some of the most sophisticated education available anywhere in the world at that time. These same students learning heart extraction techniques were also mastering advanced mathematics, developing detailed understanding of astronomy, studying complex theological concepts, and receiving training in diplomatic protocol for dealing with foreign dignitaries. The social contradictions were equally complex. Priests held enormous respect and authority within Aztec society. Yet they were also required to live under restrictions that most people would find unbearable. They couldn't marry, couldn't own personal property, couldn't participate in normal social activities, and were expected to maintain absolute moral purity while regularly performing actions that would be considered deeply immoral in almost any other context. Perhaps most puzzling to modern observers is that many priests to genuinely enjoy their profession, despite its psychological demands. Spanish accounts describe priests who seemed fulfilled by their work, took pride in their skills, and expressed genuine satisfaction with their role in maintaining cosmic order. This suggests that their training was not just technically effective, but also psychologically successful in creating individuals who could find meaning and purpose in what outsiders would consider horrific activities. The result was a priestly class unlike anything else in human history. Individuals who combined intellectual sophistication with emotional detachment, genuine religious devotion with technical expertise in homicide, and deep compassion for their community with the ability to regularly kill community members. These weren't contradictions to them. They were different aspects of the same fundamental calling. The psychological consequences of this training created priests who were simultaneously some of the most educated and most psychologically compartmentalized people in their society. Spanish chroniclers noted that these same individuals who could perform sacrifice ceremonies with calm efficiency would break down in tears when discussing the suffering of their people under conquest. They had been trained to separate their emotional responses to violence from their broader emotional capacity, creating what modern psychology might recognize as a form of selective emotional dissociation. Their communities responded to these priests with a mixture of reverence, fear, and genuine affection that seems contradictory to modern observers. People who knew that these individuals regularly killed community members also trusted them as teachers, advisors, healers, and spiritual guides. The priests' extensive education made them valuable resources for everything from medical treatment to agricultural advice, while their spiritual authority made them essential intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. The institutional reactions were equally complex. The Aztec state invested enormous resources in priestly training, recognizing that these individuals were essential for maintaining both religious and political stability. The quality of their education was so high that even Spanish colonizers, who despised their religious practices, acknowledged their intellectual capabilities and often employed them as translators, administrators, and advisors. Long-term implications of this training system extended far beyond individual psychological development. The priests' combination of intellectual sophistication and religious authority made them natural leaders during the Spanish conquest, but their training had also made them psychologically dependent on the religious system that justified their actions. When that system was destroyed, many experienced what modern psychology would recognize as severe identity crises and psychological collapse. The social consequences rippled through generations. Families who had dedicated sons to priestly training lost not just individual family members, but also their primary connections to political and religious power structures. Communities that had relied on priests for education, medical care, and spiritual guidance found themselves without these essential services when the priestly system was dismantled. Perhaps most significantly, the Spanish discovery of the sophisticated educational methods used in priestly training forced them to acknowledge that indigenous Americans possessed intellectual capabilities that contradicted European assumptions about cultural superiority. Several Spanish chroniclers admitted that Aztec priests demonstrated knowledge and skills that rivaled or exceeded those of European clergy, creating theological and philosophical problems for colonial justification narratives. Meanwhile, as these young men were transforming themselves into cosmic engineers through years of intensive training, the actual practice of sacrifice was evolving into something far more complex and varied than most people realize. The image of priests simply grabbing victims and cutting out hearts was about as accurate as describing modern surgery as doctors cutting people open with knives. The reality was that different types of sacrifice required entirely different preparation, protocols, ceremonial procedures, and spiritual approaches. A priest preparing for a solar ceremony honoring Huitzilopochtli faced completely different requirements than one preparing for an agricultural ritual dedicated to Tlaloc. The variety of sacrifice types, each with its own intricate preparation requirements, turned Aztec religious practice into something resembling a complex medical specialty with dozens of different subspecialties. Some ceremonies required months of advance preparation involving specific dietary restrictions, elaborate costume creation, detailed astronomical calculations, and coordination with multiple other religious and political officials. Others were performed on short notice in response to emergencies like droughts, eclipses, or military defeats, requiring priests to maintain constant readiness for immediate action. The psychological demands of switching between different types of ceremonies, each requiring different mental states and spiritual approaches, added another layer of complexity to priestly training and daily practice. These weren't just different procedures. They were entirely different ways of understanding the relationship between human action and cosmic order, each requiring its own form of preparation and mental conditioning. If priestly training was the graduate school of cosmic maintenance, then the actual variety of sacrifice ceremonies was like discovering that your new job as a doctor actually requires you to be simultaneously a heart surgeon, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, a veterinarian, and occasionally a dentist, except instead of healing people, you're performing elaborate theatrical productions, where the finale always involves someone dying in a very specific way. The Aztecs didn't just have human sacrifice, they had dozens of different types of sacrifice ceremonies, each with its own intricate requirements, preparation protocols, and spiritual purposes. Think of it less like a single medical procedure and more like an entire hospital system with specialized departments for different types of cosmic emergencies. You had your daily maintenance sacrifices to keep the sun rising, your seasonal agricultural ceremonies to ensure good harvests, your emergency drought response rituals, your military victory celebrations, your new building dedication ceremonies, and your oops we accidentally angered a god damage control rituals. Each type of ceremony required completely different preparation approaches. A priest preparing for Shumopili, the new fire ceremony that happened every 52 years, faced entirely different challenges than one getting ready for a daily solar feeding ritual. It was like being a chef who needed to master everything from quick breakfast preparation to elaborate wedding banquets, except the ingredients were people, and the customers were literally gods who might end the world if they didn't like the presentation. The specialization became so complex that many priests focused on specific types of ceremonies throughout their careers. Some became experts in agricultural rituals, spending their lives mastering the intricate timing and procedures required to ensure good harvests. Others specialized in military ceremonies, developing expertise in the specific requirements for honoring war gods and processing captured enemies. Still others focused on calendrical ceremonies, becoming masters of the astronomical calculations and timing requirements for major cyclical celebrations. This specialization created what was essentially a religious bureaucracy with different departments handling different aspects of cosmic maintenance. The organizational complexity rivaled modern hospital systems, with senior priests coordinating between different specialties, junior priests learning specific procedural requirements, and administrative priests managing the logistics of acquiring ceremonial materials, scheduling ceremonies, and maintaining the elaborate costumes and equipment required for different rituals. It was less like a primitive religious cult and more like a sophisticated organizational system designed to manage multiple complex ongoing projects simultaneously. Consider the preparation required for Toxcatl, the ceremony honoring Tezcatlipoca that required an entire year of advanced planning and involved what was essentially method acting taken to its ultimate extreme. The priest didn't just select a sacrifice victim. They chose a young man who would spend an entire year living as the literal embodiment of the god, complete with divine treatment, luxury accommodations, and all the privileges of deity status before his eventual ceremonial death. The preparation for this ceremony began with an extensive casting process that would make Hollywood talent scouts look casual. Priests searched throughout the empire for young men who met incredibly specific physical requirements: perfect skin, ideal proportions, specific facial features, and particular behavioral characteristics. The selected individual had to be not just physically perfect, but also psychologically capable of maintaining divine composure under the pressure of knowing his fate for an entire year. Once selected, the preparation process transformed both the victim and the participating priests. The young man received intensive training in divine behavior, learning to walk, speak, and conduct himself as a god would. He was taught to play specific musical instruments, wear elaborate costumes correctly, and perform ritual dances with precision. Meanwhile, the priests responsible for the ceremony spent months preparing costumes, coordinating with other religious officials, calculating optimal timing based on astronomical observations, and rehearsing their own roles in the elaborate performance. The Psychological preparation for everyone involved was extraordinary. The victim had to be psychologically conditioned to accept his divine status and eventual death, while the priests had to prepare themselves to kill someone they had spent months treating as a literal god. The emotional complexity of developing genuine relationships with someone you knew you would eventually sacrifice created psychological challenges that required specific meditation techniques and spiritual counseling. But Toxcatl was just one example. The preparation for meticulously, the flaying ceremony dedicated to Aztec, required entirely different skills and psychological conditioning. Priests master not just heart extraction, but also the precise skin removal techniques that would allow them to wear the victim's skin as ceremonial garments. This wasn't just gruesome theater. The ceremony required specific anatomical knowledge, surgical precision, and the ability to perform complex procedures while maintaining religious focus and proper ceremonial timing. The logistics alone were staggering. Priests had to coordinate with military leaders to ensure appropriate victims were available, work with craftsmen to prepare specialized obsidian tools for different procedures, collaborate with other priests to ensure proper astronomical timing, and manage the complex choreography required for ceremonies, involving multiple participants and elaborate costume changes. Then there were the emergency ceremonies that required priests to maintain constant readiness for immediate action. When eclipses occurred unexpectedly, when military campaigns faced setbacks, or when natural disasters threatened communities, priests had to be able to organize and perform appropriate sacrifice ceremonies on short notice. This meant maintaining stocks of ceremonial materials, keeping specialized knowledge readily accessible, and staying in psychological condition to perform traumatic procedures without advanced mental preparation. The seasonal agricultural ceremonies created their own unique challenges. Priests preparing for Etulcanwal, ceremonies designed to encourage rainfall, had to coordinate their activities with weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and community needs. They couldn't just perform these rituals on convenient dates. They had to time them according to agricultural necessity, which meant sometimes performing complex ceremonies under difficult weather conditions or during inconvenient political situations. Perhaps most challenging were the ceremonies that required priests to sacrifice children, such as those dedicated to Tlaloc during drought periods. These rituals demanded not just technical expertise and psychological detachment, but also the ability to maintain genuine religious conviction while performing actions that challenged basic human emotional responses. Priests had to develop specific mental conditioning techniques that allowed them to separate their natural protective instincts toward children from their religious obligations to the community and the gods. This wasn't isolated complexity. It was part of a broader pattern where Aztec religious practice evolved into something resembling modern specialized professional services. Just as contemporary hospitals have different departments with specialized equipment, training requirements, and procedural protocols, Aztec religious institutions developed increasingly sophisticated organizational structures designed to manage multiple complex ongoing responsibilities. The pattern extended throughout Mesoamerican civilizations, with similar specialization appearing in Maya, Zapotec, and other cultures. Each society developed its own variations on the theme of professional religious specialists, managing complex ceremonial requirements, suggesting that this level of organization was a natural response to the administrative challenges of maintaining elaborate religious systems. Why this pattern existed becomes clearer when you consider the social and political functions these ceremonies serve beyond their stated religious purposes. Different types of sacrifice ceremonies allowed rulers to respond to different types of political and social challenges. Military ceremonies reinforced social hierarchies and demonstrated state power. Agricultural ceremonies maintained community cooperation during critical seasonal periods. Emergency ceremonies provided visible responses to crises that helped maintain social stability during difficult times. The specialization also served economic functions, creating professional classes whose expertise was essential for community survival. Priests became repositories of agricultural knowledge, astronomical information, medical techniques, and administrative skills that were crucial for maintaining complex urban societies. Their specialized training in different types of ceremonies made them valuable for managing the diverse challenges facing Aztec communities. Social and political factors reinforced this pattern through feedback loops that increased organizational complexity over time. As ceremonies became more elaborate, they required more specialized knowledge, which created demand for more intensive training, which produced more highly specialized priests, which enabled even more complex ceremonies. The system became self-reinforcing, with each generation of priests adding new layers of sophistication to existing practices. The economic factors were equally important. Different types of ceremonies required different types of resources, creating supply chains that connected religious practices to trade networks, craft production, and agricultural systems. Priests had to coordinate with merchants, artisans, farmers, and military leaders to ensure that appropriate materials were available for different ceremonial requirements. This created economic incentives for maintaining and expanding the system of specialized ceremonies. Comparison to other civilizations reveals that while the specific practices were unique to Mesoamerica, the organizational patterns were remarkably similar to those found in other complex societies. Ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and classical civilizations all developed comparable systems of religious specialization, suggesting that this type of organization was a common response to the challenges of managing complex religious institutions in urban societies. The effects of this ceremonial complexity rippled through every aspect of Aztec society in ways that made the religious system inseparable from political, economic, and social organization. Who benefited most obviously were the priestly classes themselves, who became essential specialists whose expertise was crucial for community survival. Their monopoly on the knowledge required for different types of ceremonies gave them enormous social influence and economic security, but the benefits extended far beyond individual priests. The elaborate preparation requirements for different ceremonies created employment for craftsmen, merchants, farmers, and laborers who supplied the materials, foods, costumes, and equipment needed for religious activities. The religious system became a major economic driver, generating demand for specialized goods and services that supported entire industries. Communities benefited from having religious specialists who could respond appropriately to different types of crises and challenges. The variety of available ceremonies meant that there was always some appropriate religious response to whatever problems arose, whether they were agricultural, military, medical, or social. This provided psychological comfort and social stability during difficult periods. Who suffered were primarily the sacrifice victims themselves, obviously, but also communities that became dependent on a religious system that required constant inputs of human lives and economic resources. The pressure to maintain elaborate ceremonial requirements created social obligations that could be economically and emotionally devastating for families, who were expected to contribute victims, materials, or labor for religious activities. Unintended consequences included the militarization of Aztec society as the demand for sacrifice. Victims created incentives for constant warfare. The need to capture appropriate victims for different types of ceremonies influenced military strategy, diplomatic relations, and foreign policy in ways that ultimately contributed to the empire's vulnerability to Spanish conquest. The system also created psychological dependencies that made it difficult for communities to adapt. When the religious framework was destroyed, people who had relied on specific ceremonies to manage agricultural, medical, and social challenges found themselves without familiar coping mechanisms when Spanish colonization dismantled the traditional religious system. How this shaped future developments was profound and tragic. The complexity and sophistication of Aztec religious practices actually worked against them during the conquest, as Spanish observers used the elaborate nature of sacrifice ceremonies as justification for viewing indigenous peoples as inherently savage and in need of European civilization. The very organizational sophistication that had made the system effective became evidence of its moral corruption in European eyes. Modern parallels to this type of specialized professional system can be seen in contemporary healthcare, legal, services, and other professional fields where complex problems require specialized expertise and elaborate procedural protocols. The difference, of course, is that modern professional specialization is designed to solve problems rather than create ritual deaths. But the organizational patterns are remarkably similar. The lessons for contemporary issues include recognition that complex social problems often require specialized professional responses, and that the sophistication of organizational systems doesn't necessarily correlate with their moral acceptability. The Aztecs created highly effective systems for managing their perceived religious obligations, but those obligations themselves were based on premises that most modern observers would reject. Yet even as priests were mastering these dozens of different ceremonial specializations, the actual moments of sacrifice, the dramatic climaxes of all this elaborate preparation, created their own unique psychological and logistical challenges that went far beyond technical expertise. The gap between months of careful preparation and the intense, high-stakes moments of actual ceremony performance created pressure situations that would challenge even the most thoroughly trained professionals. Picture spending months preparing for a ceremony that absolutely cannot be performed incorrectly, where a mistake could theoretically end the world, definitely end your career, and possibly end your life, and then having to execute that ceremony flawlessly while dealing with struggling victims, unpredictable weather, equipment malfunctions, and crowds of thousands of observers who were also convinced that the fate of the universe depends on your performance. The psychological transition from careful, methodical preparation to high-intensity performance under extreme pressure required mental conditioning techniques that were as sophisticated as the ceremonial knowledge itself. Priests had to develop the ability to shift instantly from contemplative preparation mode to decisive action mode, maintaining religious focus and technical precision while managing their own stress responses and the unpredictable human elements involved in live ceremony performance. These moments of peak drama and intensity, where all the careful preparation collided with the messy realities of actual human sacrifice, created some of the most psychologically complex situations in Aztec religious practice. The stories that emerged from these high-pressure ceremonial moments reveal as much about human psychology under extreme stress as they do about Aztec religious beliefs. By the height of Aztec power in the early 1500s, the pressure on individual priests had reached levels that would make modern emergency room doctors look like they had relaxing jobs. The empire's success had created a situation where hundreds of different ceremonies needed to be performed throughout the year, each requiring flawless execution, and the stakes for failure had escalated to genuinely terrifying levels. The crisis wasn't just religious. It was logistical, psychological, and political all at once. As the empire expanded, the demand for sacrifice ceremonies increased exponentially. More territories meant more local gods to appease, more seasonal ceremonies to maintain, more military victories to celebrate, and more natural disasters to respond to. The priestly class found themselves managing what was essentially a packed performance schedule that would exhaust Broadway actors. Except their shows involved actual death, and the audience believed that bad reviews could literally end the world. Key players in this pressure cooker included not just the priests themselves, but also the political leaders who demanded ceremonies for every conceivable occasion. The military commanders who needed religious validation for their campaigns. The agricultural administrators who required seasonal ceremonies to maintain crop production. And the general population who had been conditioned to expect visible religious responses to every crisis or challenge. The stakes involved were multi-layered in ways that created perfect storm conditions for psychological breakdown. Individual priests faced personal consequences for mistakes that ranged from social disgrace to execution. Communities faced potential cosmic disaster if ceremonies weren't performed correctly. Political leaders faced loss of legitimacy if they couldn't provide effective religious responses to problems. Military commanders faced strategic disadvantages if their troops lost confidence in divine support. But perhaps most significantly, the entire system had evolved to a point where it was generating its own crises. The constant need for sacrifice victims was driving continuous warfare, which created military pressures that demanded even more ceremonial responses. The elaborate nature of major ceremonies was consuming enormous economic resources, which created social tensions that required additional religious management. The psychological stress on priests was leading to more mistakes and accidents, which created demands for emergency ceremonies to address the problems caused by failed ceremonies. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived, Aztec religious practice had become a high-pressure system operating at maximum capacity with no safety margins for error. The priests responsible for maintaining this system were essentially working in a situation where every day brought multiple high-stakes performances that absolutely could not be allowed to fail, while dealing with equipment that was literally designed to kill people. Audiences that included political leaders looking for excuses to eliminate rivals, and psychological pressure that would challenge the mental health of anyone forced to operate under such conditions for extended periods. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine solar ceremony at Teotihuacan in 1515, when everything that could go wrong with human sacrifice went spectacularly, catastrophically wrong in front of thousands of witnesses, including visiting dignitaries from allied cities who were there specifically to observe Aztec religious competence. The ceremony was supposed to be straightforward, a daily solar feeding ritual that experienced priests had performed thousands of times before. The victim had been properly prepared. The astronomical timing was perfect. The crowds were assembled, and the lead priest, a veteran named Meticulously, who had successfully performed similar ceremonies for over 15 years, should have been able to execute the procedure in his sleep. The build-up seemed normal. Meticulously began the preliminary rituals at dawn, performing the traditional purification ceremonies and offerings while his assistants prepared the victim and arranged the ceremonial equipment. The crowd gathered in the plaza below the pyramid, including representatives from Tlaxcala, who were technically enemies but had been granted safe passage to witness this demonstration of Aztec religious prowess. The political implications were significant. These observers would return to their cities with reports about Aztec competence that could influence future diplomatic and military relationships. As the sun reached the optimal position, Meticulously began the final approach to the sacrifice stone. The victim, a young warrior captured in a recent campaign, had been drugged with traditional preparations that were supposed to make him compliant and reduce his awareness of what was happening. But something went wrong with either the dosage or the victim's individual reaction to the drugs, because as Meticulously raised his obsidian knife for the heart extraction, the victim suddenly became fully conscious and violently resistant. What followed was a nightmare scenario that every priest had been trained to handle but hoped never to experience. The victim broke free from the restraining priests and began running around the top of the pyramid, bleeding from preliminary incisions, screaming in terror, and creating a spectacle that was both religiously inappropriate and politically embarrassing. The crowd below could see everything that was happening, and their reaction was a mixture of horror, confusion, and growing doubt about the competence of their religious leadership. Nakali and his assistants found themselves chasing a wounded, terrified victim around the top of a pyramid, while thousands of people watched, and the optimal astronomical moment for the ceremony was rapidly passing. The religious requirements demanded that the sacrifice be completed at the precisely calculated time, but the practical reality was that they were dealing with what amounted to a medical emergency, combined with a public relations disaster. In desperation, Nakali attempted to tackle the victim and complete the ceremony by force, but the obsidian knife, slippery with blood and sweat, slipped from his hands and shattered on the stone surface of the pyramid. Obsidian blades were incredibly sharp, but also extremely brittle, and the impact destroyed the primary ceremonial tool at the worst possible moment. His assistants tried to help by restraining the victim while Nakali retrieved a backup knife. But in the struggle, one of the junior priests was accidentally cut severely enough to require immediate medical attention. The ceremony was now dealing with two bleeding individuals, a shattered primary tool, a terrified and increasingly desperate victim, and a crowd that was beginning to voice their concerns about what they were witnessing. The climax came when Nakali, under enormous pressure to salvage the situation, made a desperate attempt to complete the hard extraction using a backup obsidian blade that wasn't properly consecrated for the ceremony. The victim, weakened by blood loss and shock, finally collapsed, but Nakali's technique, compromised by stress and the inferior tool, resulted in a botched extraction that took several attempts and created a gruesome spectacle that was religiously invalid and psychologically traumatic for everyone involved. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The crowd below began dispersing in confusion and fear. The visiting dignitaries were clearly appalled by what they had witnessed. The injured assistant priest required emergency medical care, and Nakali himself was visibly shaken by the experience. The ceremony that was supposed to ensure the sun's continued rise had become a public demonstration of religious incompetence that threatened to undermine confidence in the entire Aztec religious system. But the most devastating consequence was psychological. Nakali, who had spent decades building confidence in his abilities and developing the mental conditioning necessary to perform human sacrifice regularly, experienced what modern psychology would recognize as a severe traumatic stress reaction. He became convinced that his failure had genuinely endangered the cosmic order, and his guilt and anxiety about the incident made it impossible for him to perform future ceremonies with the confidence and precision required for the job. The response was swift, harsh, and designed to contain what religious and political leaders recognized as a potentially catastrophic threat to social stability. The immediate religious reaction focused on damage control. Senior priests performed emergency purification ceremonies designed to undo any cosmic harm caused by the failed sacrifice, while temple administrators worked frantically to prevent news of the incident from spreading to other cities, where it might undermine confidence in Aztec religious competence. Political leaders faced their own crisis management challenges. The visiting Tlaxcalan dignitaries had witnessed clear evidence that Aztec religious practices were fallible, which undermined the psychological warfare advantage that came from having enemies believe that Aztec priests possessed infallible divine connections. Diplomatic representatives were quickly dispatched to other cities with alternative explanations for what had happened, ranging from claims that the ceremony had actually been successful, despite appearances to suggestions that the incident had been a deliberate test of observer loyalty. The social fallout was immediate and severe. Community members who had witnessed the failed ceremony began expressing doubts about other religious practices, asking questions about whether previous ceremonies had been performed correctly, and demanding additional ceremonies to ensure that no cosmic damage had been done. The psychological foundation of community confidence in religious leadership had been shaken in ways that created ripple effects throughout the social system. Nakali himself became a sacrificial victim of a different sort. Unable to continue performing ceremonies due to his psychological trauma from the incident, he was quietly removed from active priestly duties and assigned to administrative work that kept him away from public religious functions. His assistants received additional training and psychological counseling designed to help them process the traumatic experience and return to active ceremony performance. The institutional reactions were designed to prevent similar incidents in the future while maintaining public confidence in the religious system. Training protocols were modified to include more intensive preparation for emergency situations. Backup equipment requirements were expanded, and psychological support systems were developed to help priests cope with the stress of high-stakes ceremony performance. Long-term implications extended far beyond the immediate participants. The incident became a case study used in priestly training to illustrate the importance of maintaining mental composure under pressure, and it influenced the development of new protocols for managing crowd control during major ceremonies. More significantly, it contributed to growing awareness among religious leaders that the pressure on individual priests had reached unsustainable levels. The economic consequences were substantial. The resources invested in the failed ceremony were completely wasted. Additional ceremonies were required to address the perceived cosmic damage, and the diplomatic implications of the incident required expensive efforts to rebuild relationships with allied cities. The incident demonstrated how religious failures could have cascading effects that impacted military, political, and economic systems. Perhaps most ironically, the failed ceremony actually provided valuable insights into Aztec religious psychology that wouldn't have been available from successful ceremonies. The reactions of priests, political leaders, and community members to the crisis revealed how deeply the religious system was integrated into every aspect of social functioning, and how fragile the psychological foundations of the system actually were despite their apparent strength and sophistication. The incident also highlighted the inherent contradictions in a system that required flawless performance of inherently traumatic procedures. The psychological conditioning that enabled priests to perform human sacrifice regularly also made them vulnerable to severe trauma when things went wrong, creating a built-in instability that threatened the long-term sustainability of the entire religious system. This catastrophic ceremony failure wasn't just an embarrassing mistake. It was a revealing glimpse into the fundamental psychological and structural weaknesses that were built into the entire Aztec religious system. What appeared to be a robust, sophisticated, and reliable system for managing cosmic order was actually operating on psychological and logistical margins, so thin that a single bad day could threaten the credibility of the entire enterprise. The incident revealed that the Aztec religious system had evolved into something that was simultaneously highly sophisticated and extremely fragile. The same factors that made it effective, the elaborate preparation requirements, the precise timing demands, the psychological conditioning of priests, and the community investment in ceremony outcomes, also made it vulnerable to spectacular failures that could undermine public confidence in ways that simpler religious systems wouldn't experience. What this exposed about Aztec society was the degree to which their entire social order depended on maintaining public belief in the infallibility of religious practices. Unlike religious systems that could accommodate occasional failures or mistakes, Aztec sacrifice ceremonies were supposed to be literally perfect because imperfection could theoretically result in cosmic disaster. This created a psychological House of cards where any visible failure threatened to bring down confidence in the entire system. The long-term effects of incidents like this contributed to what historians now recognize as a growing crisis of confidence in traditional religious practices that made Aztec society psychologically vulnerable to the disruption caused by Spanish conquest. Communities that had been conditioned to expect religious infallibility were poorly prepared to cope with the systematic destruction of their religious institutions. Modern historians still debate whether this type of religious system was inherently unsustainable or whether it could have evolved mechanisms for handling failure more effectively if it had been given more time to develop. The Spanish conquest interrupted what might have been a natural evolution toward more psychologically robust religious practices, leaving us with questions about how indigenous American societies might have adapted to the internal contradictions in their religious systems. Perhaps most significantly, the incident illustrates how complex religious systems can become victims of their own success. The Aztec religious system had become so elaborate and sophisticated that it required performance standards that were ultimately impossible for human beings to maintain consistently, creating conditions where psychological breakdown was inevitable, rather than just possible. The very features that made the system impressive also made it unsustainable. Around the dramatic world of Aztec sacrifice ceremonies, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles that made the entire system possible and occasionally impossible. These weren't just background players. They were essential specialists whose individual stories revealed just how complex and interconnected the sacrifice system really was. Meet Itzel, not a priest but a master obsidian napper, whose job was creating the surgical-grade blades that made heart extraction possible. This wasn't your average craftsman. Itzel was essentially a precision toolmaker, whose products had to be sharper than modern surgical steel, while also being spiritually appropriate for religious use. He spent his days creating blades so thin they could slice through skin without the victim feeling the initial cut, yet strong enough to penetrate rib cage without shattering at the worst possible moment. The pressure on this guy was extraordinary. Imagine being a blacksmith whose horseshoes might cause the apocalypse if they weren't perfect. Itzel's workshop was like a combination of high-tech, laboratory, and spiritual retreat. He had to maintain ritual purity while working, which meant specific dietary restrictions, regular purification ceremonies, and absolute focus on the spiritual significance of his craft. Each blade required hours of careful work, with specific prayers and offerings, made during different stages of the creation process. A single obsidian blade might take days to complete properly, and Itzel was expected to produce dozens of them for major ceremonies while maintaining quality standards that would impress modern surgical instrument manufacturers. Then there was Cypactli, whose official title was something like Victim Procurement Specialist, but whose actual job was more complex than any human resources department nightmare. Cypactli was responsible for identifying, acquiring, and preparing sacrifice victims according to incredibly specific requirements that varied for different ceremonies. Some rituals required children of particular ages. Others needed adult warriors with specific combat experience. And still others demanded individuals with certain physical characteristics or social backgrounds. Cypactli's work involved coordination, with military commanders returning from campaigns, negotiation with allied cities for prisoner exchanges, and occasionally recruitment of volunteers from within Aztec society itself. Yes, volunteers, because some Aztec ceremonies offered victims such high status and spiritual rewards that people actually competed for the honor of being sacrificed. Cypactli had to manage what was essentially a complex logistics operation that combined military coordination, diplomatic negotiation, and psychological counseling all in one impossible job description. But perhaps most psychologically complex was Yotl, a former priest who had been reassigned to victim preparation after developing what we might recognize today as severe PTSD from performing too many ceremonies. Yodel's new job involved spending weeks or months with selected victims, helping them understand their spiritual significance, teaching them the proper behaviors expected during ceremonies, and providing psychological support to help them accept their fate with appropriate dignity. Yodel represented the human cost of the sacrifice system in ways that the dramatic ceremony moments couldn't capture. He was someone who had been deeply committed to the religious system, had performed his duties successfully for years, but had eventually been psychologically broken by the cumulative trauma of regularly killing people he had come to know personally. His reassignment to victim preparation was both a kindness, allowing him to remain within the religious system despite his inability to perform sacrifices, and a cruel irony that forced him to form emotional connections with people he knew would eventually be killed by his former colleagues. The stories of these supporting characters reveal the extensive human infrastructure required to maintain the sacrifice system. Every ceremony involved dozens of people with specialized skills and knowledge, from the craftsmen who created ceremonial equipment to the administrators who managed scheduling and logistics to the medical specialists who provided care for priests and victims alike. These individuals often developed complex relationships with each other and with the priests they supported. Itzel and Sipakli had to coordinate their work to ensure that appropriate blades were available for specific types of victims. Yodel had to work with both Sipakli and the priests to ensure smooth transitions from victim acquisition through preparation to final ceremony. The interdependence created a web of professional and personal relationships that made the sacrifice system as much a social community as a religious institution. These weren't isolated individual stories. They were part of an intricate network of relationships, dependencies, and unintended consequences that made Aztec sacrifice ceremonies resemble complex theatrical productions where everyone's performance affected everyone else's success or failure. Consider what happened when Itzel's workshop was destroyed in a fire during the dry season of 1518. This wasn't just a personal disaster for one craftsman. It created a supply chain crisis that rippled through the entire religious system. Ceremonies had to be postponed because appropriate blades weren't available. Priests who had been training for specific rituals found their preparation schedules disrupted. Sipakli had to adjust victim procurement timelines because there was no point in acquiring sacrifices if the tools needed to sacrifice them weren't ready. The fire also revealed how politically connected these supporting roles had become. Itzel wasn't just a craftsman. He was someone whose expertise was considered essential for state security. When his workshop burned, political leaders immediately allocated resources for rebuilding that would normally have been reserved for military or administrative needs. The incident demonstrated that these supporting characters had actually become integral to the functioning of the Aztec state in ways that made them politically powerful, despite their theoretically subordinate roles. The webs of relationships extended beyond professional necessity into genuine personal connections that created emotional complications for everyone involved. Yodel, despite his psychological trauma from performing sacrifices, had developed friendships with both Itzel and Sipakli based on their shared understanding of the psychological pressures involved in sacrifice-related work. These relationships provided emotional support for people working in inherently traumatic professions, but they also created conflicts when personal loyalty clashed with professional obligations. Political and social networks connected these individuals to broader power structures in ways that influenced how the sacrifice system actually functioned. Itzel's brother was a minor military commander whose campaigns provided some of the prisoners that Sipakli processed, creating family connections that affected victim selection and blade allocation. Yodel's former position as a priest gave him ongoing relationships with active religious officials that influenced how victim preparation was conducted and how failed priests were treated within the religious hierarchy. The unintended consequences of these interconnections were both beneficial and problematic for the overall system. On the positive side, the personal relationships between specialists created informal communication networks that helped coordinate complex ceremonies more effectively than formal bureaucratic channels could have managed. When problems arose, people who knew and trusted each other could work together to find creative solutions that preserved the religious requirements while adapting to practical limitations. But the same personal connections also created vulnerabilities that could threaten the entire system. When Sapakli developed romantic feelings for a prisoner who had been designated for an important ceremony, his emotional involvement compromised his professional judgment in ways that created problems for priests, political leaders, and the victim herself. The incident required intervention from senior religious officials and created new policies about emotional detachment that affected how all victim preparation was conducted. Perhaps most significantly, these interconnected relationships created informal power structures that sometimes conflicted with the official religious and political hierarchies. Itzel's expertise made him influential in ways that allowed him to affect ceremony planning and resource allocation despite having no formal religious or political authority. Sapakli's control over victim selection gave him leverage over priests and political leaders who needed his cooperation for their own success. The social dynamics within this network of specialists also influenced how the sacrifice system evolved over time. New techniques, modified procedures, and innovative solutions to practical problems often emerged from conversations between these supporting characters rather than from formal religious instruction or political direction. The system was constantly being refined and adapted through the daily interactions of people who were actually responsible for making it work in practice. These relationships also provided emotional and psychological support that helped individuals cope with the traumatic aspects of their work. People who were regularly involved in human sacrifice, whether as primary performers or supporting specialists, needed communities of understanding that could only come from others who shared similar experiences. The friendships and professional relationships between these characters created informal support networks that were essential for maintaining the psychological health of everyone involved in the system. To understand how these supporting characters fit into Aztec society, you have to understand that human sacrifice wasn't considered horrific or abnormal. It was viewed as essential maintenance work that kept the universe functioning properly. From the Aztec perspective, Itzel wasn't making murder weapons. He was crafting precision tools for cosmic engineering. Sapakli wasn't kidnapping people. He was recruiting heroes for the most important job in the universe. Yodel wasn't traumatized by killing. He was overwhelmed by the responsibility of maintaining existence itself. Daily life in Tenochtitlan included human sacrifice as a normal, visible, and socially respected activity. Children grew up watching ceremonies, understanding that sacrifice was how responsible adults maintained cosmic order. Young people considered careers in sacrifice-related fields, the way modern students might consider medicine or engineering, as challenging, respected professions that required specialized training and served essential social functions. The beliefs and attitudes that made this system psychologically sustainable were deeply integrated into every aspect of Aztec culture. People didn't see individual human lives as having independent value separate from their contribution to cosmic maintenance. Death in sacrifice was considered the highest possible honor, providing spiritual benefits that made earthly death meaningful and worthwhile. The concept of individual rights or personal autonomy simply didn't exist in the way modern societies understand them. social structures reinforced these attitudes through institutional practices that made sacrifice seem natural and necessary. Religious education taught children that sacrifice was how the gods had created the world and how humans maintained their part of the cosmic bargain. Military training emphasized that capture and warfare could lead to glorious death in sacrifice. Ceremonies. Economic systems included sacrifice-related work as normal employment that provided social status and economic security. What was considered normal versus exceptional reveals how different Aztec psychological frameworks were from modern perspectives. Regular human sacrifice was normal. Failing to perform appropriate ceremonies was exceptional and dangerous. Individual emotional attachment to specific victims was exceptional. Professional detachment from people destined for sacrifice was normal. Questioning the necessity of sacrifice was exceptional. Accepting sacrifice as cosmic requirement was normal. This cultural context explains how people like Itzel, Sipactli, and Yodel could function within the sacrifice system without considering themselves monsters or criminals. They were operating within a worldview that made their work not just adaptable, but essential for the survival of everything they cared about. Their psychological struggles weren't caused by moral conflicts about the rightness of sacrifice, but by the practical and emotional challenges of performing difficult work under high-pressure conditions. The cultural framework also explains why the Spanish conquest was so psychologically devastating for these communities. When the religious system that justified and explained sacrifice was destroyed, people who had built their entire identities around sacrifice-related work found themselves without psychological frameworks for understanding their past actions or their place in society. The cultural context that had made sacrifice meaningful disappeared, leaving individuals to cope with traumatic memories without the belief system that had originally made those experiences tolerable. Perhaps most fascinating was the contradiction between the Aztec sacrifice system's reputation for ruthless efficiency and the reality that it was operated by people who were often incredibly compassionate, psychologically sensitive, and emotionally complex individuals struggling with the human costs of their religious obligations. Itzel, the master blade craftsman, was known throughout Tenochtitlan for his kindness to animals and his gentle treatment of apprentices. Yet, he spent his days creating instruments specifically designed to kill people as efficiently as possible. He would rescue injured birds, carefully nursing them back to health, while simultaneously perfecting techniques for creating blades that could penetrate human rib cages without causing unnecessary suffering. The same hands that tenderly cared for wounded creatures also crafted tools for ending human lives. Sipactli managed a procurement system that required him to evaluate people as potential sacrifice victims. Yet he was famous for his ability to provide emotional support and practical assistance to community members facing personal crises. People sought his advice about family problems, financial difficulties, and relationship issues because he was known for his empathy and wisdom. The same person who could dispassionately assess someone's suitability for sacrifice could also provide genuine comfort and guidance to people struggling with everyday challenges. Most ironically, Yodel's psychological breakdown from performing too many sacrifices had actually made him more effective at victim preparation because his trauma had given him deep understanding of the emotional challenges faced by people approaching their own deaths. His inability to continue killing people had made him uniquely qualified to help others prepare for being killed, creating a situation where his psychological wounds became professional qualifications. The broader contradictions extended throughout the system. The same society that performed human sacrifice regularly also had sophisticated medical knowledge and healing practices. They could expertly remove a human heart while also performing successful brain surgery to treat injuries. They developed elaborate techniques for ending lives while simultaneously creating advanced agricultural methods for sustaining lives. Modern parallels to these contradictions can be seen in contemporary professions that require people to perform psychologically difficult tasks while maintaining personal humanity. Military professionals, emergency medical workers, and law enforcement officers often develop similar psychological compartmentalization that allows them to function effectively in their jobs while remaining caring, empathetic individuals in their personal lives. The difference, of course, is that modern professionals are generally trying to save lives rather than end them. But the psychological mechanisms for coping with traumatic work requirements are remarkably similar across cultures and time periods. Everything changed when Spanish ships appeared on the horizon in 1519, carrying men who would look at the most sophisticated religious system in the Americas and declare it the work of the devil, which was particularly ironic considering these same Europeans were fresh from their own Inquisition, where they had been burning people alive for having incorrect religious opinions. The arrival of Hernan Cortes and his conquistadors wasn't just a military invasion. It was a collision between two completely incompatible worldviews that made meaningful communication almost impossible. The Spanish saw human sacrifice and immediately concluded they were dealing with savage, devil worshippers who needed to be civilized through conquest and conversion. The Aztecs saw Spanish horses, guns, and metal armor and initially wondered if these might be gods returning from legend, which led to diplomatic responses that the Spanish interpreted as either submission or elaborate trickery. This turning point was different from the various political and military challenges the Aztec Empire had faced before because it represented a fundamental challenge to the religious framework that justified and explained everything about their society. Previous conflicts had been with other Mesoamerican cultures who shared basic assumptions about gods, sacrifice, and cosmic order, even if they disagreed about specific practices or political arrangements. The Spanish represented something unprecedented. People who rejected the entire premise that human sacrifice was necessary or acceptable. The key factors that led to this transformation went beyond military technology or political strategy. The Spanish brought epidemic diseases that killed millions of indigenous people, creating demographic collapse that made traditional religious practices impossible to maintain. They brought a missionary zeal that was determined to destroy indigenous religious institutions completely, rather than simply conquering them. Most importantly, they brought alternative explanations for natural phenomena that competed directly with Aztec religious worldviews. When Spanish priests demonstrated European astronomical knowledge, predicted eclipses using different methods, and explained natural disasters without reference to angry gods requiring sacrifice, they weren't just offering alternative religious practices. They were challenging the fundamental assumptions that made Aztec sacrifice seem necessary and rational. The cognitive dissonance was enormous for people who had built their entire understanding of reality around the belief that human sacrifice was essential for cosmic maintenance. The psychological impact on Aztec priests was particularly devastating because their entire identity and social purpose was tied to knowledge and practices that the Spanish were systematically discrediting. Imagine spending decades training to become a brain surgeon, developing expertise that your community considers essential for survival, and then encountering people who claim that brain surgery is not only unnecessary, but actively harmful. The challenge wasn't just professional, it was existential. But perhaps most significantly, the Spanish arrival coincided with internal problems within the Aztec sacrifice system that had been building for years. The psychological pressure on priests had been increasing. The economic costs of elaborate ceremonies had been straining resources, and the constant warfare required to obtain sacrifice victims had been creating political instabilities that made the empire vulnerable to external threats. The Spanish conquest succeeded partly because it happened at a moment when the Aztec system was already under internal stress that made it less capable of responding effectively to unprecedented challenges. The unfolding of change wasn't a simple military conquest followed by religious conversion. It was a complex, chaotic process that played out over decades and involved resistance, adaptation, confusion, and gradual transformation in ways that were traumatic for everyone involved. Resistance to change came from multiple directions and took forms that the Spanish hadn't anticipated. Some Aztec priests initially tried to incorporate Spanish religious elements into traditional ceremonies, creating hybrid rituals that combined Christian prayers with human sacrifice in attempts to hedge their spiritual bets. These efforts horrified Spanish missionaries, who saw them as diabolic corruption of Christian practices, and confused Aztec communities, who weren't sure whether these new hybrid ceremonies were religiously valid or dangerous innovations. Other resistance took the form of hidden continuation of traditional practices. Priests who publicly converted to Christianity maintained secret sacrifice ceremonies in remote locations, developing elaborate systems of concealment and coded communication that allowed them to continue what they considered essential cosmic maintenance work. These underground religious networks operated for decades after the Spanish conquest, creating parallel religious systems that the colonial government struggled to identify and eliminate. Champions of change included not just Spanish conquistadors and missionaries, but also some indigenous leaders who recognized that traditional practices had become impossible to maintain and saw conversion as a survival strategy. These individuals faced enormous social pressure from their own communities, who often viewed them as traitors, while also dealing with Spanish suspicion about the sincerity of their conversions. The specific steps and stages of transformation reveal how difficult it was to completely eliminate religious practices that have been integrated into every aspect of daily life. The Spanish could destroy temples and execute priests, but they couldn't easily eliminate the psychological frameworks that made sacrifice seem necessary. The process required not just military conquest, but also sustained educational efforts, designed to teach indigenous people alternative explanations for natural phenomena and different approaches to managing uncertainty and crisis. Obstacles encountered by both sides created unexpected complications that prolonged the transformation process. Spanish missionaries discovered that simply forbidding human sacrifice wasn't sufficient because the underlying beliefs that made sacrifice seem necessary remained intact even after the practices were eliminated. Indigenous communities found that converting to Christianity didn't solve the psychological problems that traditional religious practices had been designed to address, leaving them without familiar coping mechanisms for dealing with natural disasters, illness, and other crises. Breakthrough moments came when both sides began developing more sophisticated understanding of each other's perspectives and finding ways to address the underlying psychological and social needs that different religious practices had been serving. Some Spanish missionaries learned indigenous languages and spent years studying traditional beliefs in order to develop more effective conversion strategies. Some indigenous leaders found ways to incorporate Christian concepts into traditional social structures without completely abandoning their cultural identity. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces created tensions that influenced how change unfolded in different communities. In some areas, individual charismatic leaders on both sides managed to negotiate transitions that preserved some traditional practices within Christian frameworks. In other areas, larger political and economic forces made such accommodation impossible, leading to more violent and traumatic transformations. Disease played a crucial role that neither side could control or predict. Epidemic illnesses killed so many people that traditional religious institutions simply couldn't function. regardless of anyone's intentions about religious conversion. Communities that might have maintained traditional practices for generations found themselves without enough trained priests, ceremonial specialists, or community members to carry on complex religious traditions. Economic factors also drove change in ways that went beyond religious conviction or political pressure. The Spanish colonial system created new economic opportunities that required indigenous people to participate in European-style institutions, making traditional religious practices increasingly impractical regardless of personal beliefs. People who might have preferred to maintain traditional ways of life found themselves forced to adapt to colonial economic systems that made old religious practices impossible to sustain. Thought the process was further complicated by the fact that Spanish colonization wasn't uniform or consistent. Different colonial administrators, missionaries, and military leaders had different approaches to dealing with indigenous religious practices, creating a patchwork of policies that made it difficult for indigenous communities to understand what was expected of them or develop consistent survival strategies. Perhaps most tragically, the change process often created situations where indigenous people were caught between worlds, unable to return to traditional practices that had been destroyed, but also unable to fully embrace Spanish alternatives that didn't address their cultural and psychological needs. This left many individuals and communities in psychological limbo that contributed to social problems that persisted for generations after the initial conquest. The new colonial system that emerged from this chaotic transformation was a bizarre hybrid that satisfied neither Spanish expectations nor indigenous needs, creating a society that was perpetually unstable and psychologically uncomfortable for everyone involved. For former Aztec priests and sacrifice specialists, the new reality was particularly disorienting. People who had spent their lives as respected religious professionals found themselves reclassified as either potential converts to be saved or dangerous devil worshippers to be eliminated. Those who survived the transition often became translators, scribes, or low-level administrators in the colonial system, using their education and literacy skills in ways that were completely divorced from their original religious purposes. The Spanish quickly discovered that eliminating human sacrifice didn't automatically create the peaceful Christian society they had envisioned. Indigenous communities that had been accustomed to using religious ceremonies to manage social tensions, respond to crises, and maintain community cohesion found themselves without familiar mechanisms for dealing with these ongoing human needs. The result was often social instability, psychological distress, and resistance movements that created ongoing security problems for colonial administrators. New rules and norms emerged through trial and error as both sides struggled to create workable systems for coexistence. Indigenous people were required to attend Christian religious services, but often weren't provided with meaningful education about Christian beliefs, leading to superficial conversion that satisfied Spanish legal requirements without creating genuine religious transformation. Spanish colonists were supposed to treat indigenous people as potential Christians deserving of salvation, but also needed to exploit indigenous labor for economic purposes, creating contradictions that made consistent policy implementation impossible. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically revealed the complexity of cultural transformation. Many aspects of daily life, agricultural practices, family structures, local governance systems, and economic relationships remained largely unchanged because the Spanish lacked the personnel and knowledge necessary to micromanage indigenous communities. But the religious and spiritual frameworks that had given meaning to these daily practices were completely disrupted, leaving people performing familiar activities within totally altered psychological contexts. The colonial legal system attempted to regulate the transition by forbidding specific practices while allowing others. But these distinctions often made little sense from indigenous perspectives. Traditional ceremonies that didn't involve human sacrifice might be permitted, but the removal of sacrifice elements often made the remaining ritual actions meaningless within indigenous religious frameworks, like trying to perform surgery while forbidding the use of scalpels. Economic changes were often more immediately impactful than religious ones. The Spanish colonial system required indigenous communities to produce tribute payments, provide labor for Spanish enterprises, and participate in European-style market economies that had very different assumptions about property ownership, individual responsibility, and economic relationships. These changes often forced alterations in daily life that were more disruptive than religious conversion requirements. Educational changes created generational conflicts that persisted for centuries. Children who were educated in Spanish colonial schools learned different languages, different religious concepts, and different assumptions about social organization than their parents had grown up with, creating communication gaps between generations that made cultural transmission increasingly difficult. The psychological impact of these changes was profound, but often invisible to Spanish observers who focused on external compliance with colonial requirements. Indigenous communities developed complex strategies for psychological survival that involved maintaining traditional worldviews privately while displaying appropriate colonial behaviors publicly, creating internal contradictions that contributed to ongoing mental health problems and social instability. Perhaps most significantly, the new reality created a situation where neither traditional indigenous solutions nor Spanish colonial solutions were fully effective for addressing the practical challenges of daily life in colonial society, leaving communities to develop improvised, hybrid approaches that were often unsatisfying to everyone involved. Was this transformation ultimately positive or negative? The answer depends entirely on your perspective, time frame, and criteria for evaluation, which is why this question has generated centuries of historical debate with no clear resolution. From a Spanish colonial perspective, the elimination of human sacrifice represented obvious moral progress that justified the conquest despite its costs. Spanish observers genuinely believed they were saving souls and eliminating evil practices, and they could point to concrete evidence that thousands of people were no longer being killed in religious ceremonies. The introduction of European technology, agricultural techniques, and educational systems provided practical benefits that improved some aspects of indigenous life. Even if the overall impact was traumatic. From an indigenous perspective, the transformation represented cultural genocide that destroyed sophisticated social systems and replaced them with exploitative colonial arrangements that served Spanish interests rather than indigenous needs. The loss of traditional religious practices meant the destruction of meaning-making systems that had sustained communities for centuries, leaving people without familiar ways of understanding their place in the universe or coping with life's challenges. Short-term versus long-term effects create additional complexity in any evaluation. The immediate short-term effects were clearly catastrophic for indigenous communities: massive population loss from disease, violent disruption of social institutions, and traumatic elimination of cultural practices. But some long-term effects might be considered beneficial, including access to global trade networks, literacy in European languages, and integration into larger political and economic systems. Unintended consequences complicate any simple moral evaluation. The Spanish didn't intend to cause demographic collapse through epidemic disease, but that consequence was far more devastating than the human sacrifice they were trying to eliminate. Indigenous resistance and adaptation strategies weren't intended to create centuries of cultural confusion and psychological conflict, but those were inevitable results of attempting to preserve traditional values within colonial systems. Modern judgment versus contemporary views. reveals how historical perspective influences evaluation. Contemporary Spanish observers genuinely believed they were performing moral good by eliminating practices they considered evil, while contemporary indigenous people experienced the transformation as an attack on everything they considered sacred and meaningful. Modern observers might judge both perspectives as understandable within their own cultural contexts while still recognizing the tremendous human costs involved. Perhaps the most honest evaluation is that this transformation was historically inevitable, given the technological and demographic advantages that Europeans possessed. But that inevitability doesn't make the process less tragic for the communities that experienced it, or reduce the moral complexity involved in evaluating the collision between fundamentally incompatible worldv, i.e. W is dot, in the years and decades that followed the Spanish conquest. What remained of the Aztec sacrifice system evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to the original priests. A strange underground network of modified practices, hidden beliefs, and psychological coping mechanisms that operated in the shadows of colonial society, like a religious resistance movement run by people who weren't entirely sure what they were resisting. The immediate aftermath created a generation of former priests and sacrifice specialists who found themselves in the bizarre position of being the world's leading experts in a profession that no longer legally existed. Imagine being a master craftsman whose entire skill set had suddenly been declared illegal, except instead of losing your job, you were at risk of being burned alive for practicing your trade. These individuals had to navigate the psychological challenge of maintaining their identity and expertise, while completely suppressing any visible evidence of their knowledge. Some adapted by becoming what we might call religious archaeologists, secretly preserving knowledge about traditional ceremonies, astronomical calculations, and ritual procedures without actually performing them. They created hidden libraries of information, taught selected students in complete secrecy, and maintained the intellectual framework of the sacrifice system while abandoning its practical application. It was like running a medical school that could teach anatomy and surgical procedures, but couldn't allow students to actually touch patients. Others developed elaborate systems of symbolic substitution, replacing human sacrifice with animal sacrifice, replacing actual heart extraction with symbolic representations, and replacing public ceremonies with private meditation practices that maintained the spiritual essence of traditional rituals without the elements that Spanish authorities found objectionable. These modified practices often satisfied neither traditional religious requirements nor Spanish colonial expectations, creating religious practices that felt incomplete to everyone involved. New challenges emerged from the collision between traditional religious needs and colonial reality. Indigenous communities still face droughts, diseases, natural disasters, and social crises that they had previously addressed through sacrifice ceremonies, but they no longer had access to the religious tools they had traditionally used for managing these challenges. The result was often psychological distress, social instability, and desperate searches for alternative coping mechanisms that could provide the community support and cosmic reassurance that sacrifice ceremonies had previously offered. The evolution of the situation was complicated by the fact that Spanish colonial authorities were often inconsistent in their approach to indigenous religious practices. Some administrators focused primarily on eliminating the most visible aspects of traditional religion while tolerating private beliefs that didn't threaten colonial stability. Others attempted comprehensive religious conversion that required indigenous people to completely abandon traditional worldviews. The lack of consistent policy made it difficult for indigenous communities to develop stable survival strategies. Second generation effects included psychological trauma that extended far beyond the individuals who had directly participated in the original sacrifice system. Children who grew up during the transition often experienced identity conflicts between the traditional values their parents taught them privately and the colonial values they were required to display publicly. These psychological contradictions created ongoing mental health problems and social tensions that persisted for generations after the initial conquest. Perhaps most significantly, the aftermath period revealed how deeply integrated the sacrifice system had been into every aspect of Aztec society. Eliminating human sacrifice didn't just change religious practices, it disrupted legal systems that had been based on religious authority, economic relationships that have been organized around ceremonial requirements, educational institutions that had been managed by priests, and social hierarchies that had been justified by religious frameworks. The ripple effects touched every aspect of daily life in ways that Spanish colonizers hadn't anticipated and weren't prepared to address. The colonial period introduced a fascinating cast of new characters who emerged to fill the vacuum left by the destruction of traditional religious institutions, creating hybrid roles that combined elements of indigenous tradition with colonial necessity in ways that were often psychologically and culturally uncomfortable for everyone involved. Enter Father José de Acosta, a Spanish Jesuit missionary, who became obsessed with understanding Aztec religious practices in order to convert indigenous people more effectively. Unlike many of his colleagues who simply condemned indigenous religion as devil worship, Acosta spent years learning Nahuatl, studying traditional beliefs, and developing conversion strategies that acknowledged the sophistication of indigenous theological concepts. He was essentially an early anthropologist whose research was motivated by evangelical rather than academic purposes. Acosta's approach differed dramatically from earlier Spanish religious efforts because he recognized that simply forbidding traditional practices wasn't sufficient for creating genuine religious conversion. He developed what he called spiritual bridge building, creating Christian religious practices that incorporated elements of indigenous ceremony and belief in ways that made Christianity more psychologically accessible to indigenous communities. His innovations included Christian ceremonies that used traditional music, incorporated familiar ritual elements, and addressed the same psychological needs that sacrifice ceremonies had previously served. But perhaps most interesting was his relationship with former Aztec priests who became his informants and collaborators. These individuals found themselves in the strange position of teaching their traditional religious knowledge to Spanish missionaries, who intended to use that information to eliminate traditional religion more effectively. The psychological complexity of this relationship created ongoing tensions between cultural preservation and cultural betrayal that were never fully resolved. Then there was Domingo de San Anton Manon Chimalpahin, an indigenous historian and chronicler who spent his life documenting traditional practices and beliefs for Spanish colonial authorities while simultaneously preserving indigenous historical knowledge for future generations. Chimalpahin represented a new type of cultural translator who could navigate between indigenous and Spanish worldviews in ways that served both communities. But his work also highlighted the impossible position of indigenous intellectuals who were expected to serve colonial interests while maintaining their own cultural identity. Chimalpahin's contributions included detailed accounts of traditional ceremonies, explanations of indigenous historical perspectives, and translations of indigenous texts that provided Spanish authorities with information they needed for colonial administration. But he also used his position to preserve indigenous knowledge that might otherwise have been lost, creating a hidden archive of cultural information that was disguised as colonial documentation. The new religious roles that emerged during this period were often psychologically demanding in ways that traditional positions hadn't been. Indigenous people who became Christian converts were expected to abandon traditional beliefs completely. But they were also expected to serve as cultural intermediaries who could help Spanish authorities understand and manage indigenous communities. This created impossible psychological contradictions that required individuals to simultaneously reject and preserve traditional knowledge. Spanish colonial administrators found themselves needing indigenous expertise for practical governance purposes, creating new political roles for former priests and traditional leaders who could provide information about local customs, agricultural practices, and social organization. These positions offered some indigenous people opportunities to maintain influence and status within colonial society, but they also required them to use their traditional knowledge in service of systems that were designed to eliminate traditional. Misconception culture. Perhaps most tragically, the colonial period created a generation of cultural orphans, indigenous people who were too young to have participated in traditional religious practices, but too old to be fully integrated into Spanish colonial society. These individuals often developed hybrid identities that combined elements of both cultures, but never felt fully comfortable in either, creating psychological conflicts that contributed to ongoing social problems in colonial communities. But some problems persisted in ways that revealed how deeply rooted the psychological and social functions of the sacrifice system had been, creating ongoing challenges that neither Spanish colonial solutions nor indigenous adaptation strategies could adequately address. The continuing psychological need for religious practices that could manage community anxiety during crises proved particularly intractable. Indigenous communities that had relied on sacrifice ceremonies to provide visible responses to droughts, earthquakes, epidemics, and other disasters found that Christian prayers and masses didn't provide the same sense of active intervention and cosmic control that traditional ceremonies had offered. The result was often persistent anxiety, social unrest, and desperate searches for alternative practices that could provide psychological relief. During difficult periods, religious syncretism created new versions of old problems as indigenous communities developed hybrid practices that combined Christian and traditional elements in ways that satisfied neither religious system completely. These syncretic practices often maintained the psychological structure of sacrifice ceremonies, while replacing human victims with symbolic substitutes. But the symbolic substitutions didn't provide the same emotional catharsis and community bonding that actual sacrifice had created. The result was religious practices that felt incomplete and unsatisfying to participants while still appearing threatening and illegitimate to Spanish authorities. The cyclical patterns of resistance and suppression created ongoing instability that made consistent cultural adaptation impossible. Just as indigenous communities would develop stable hybrid practices that seemed to work within colonial constraints, Spanish authorities would discover these practices and implement new suppression efforts that forced communities to develop different adaptation strategies. This constant cycle of adaptation and suppression prevented the development of stable cultural solutions that could meet both indigenous psychological needs and Spanish colonial requirements. Economic issues related to traditional religious practices proved equally persistent. The Aztec sacrifice system had been integrated into economic relationships through tribute requirements, ceremonial markets, and craft specialization that supported religious activities. Eliminating sacrifice ceremonies didn't eliminate the economic needs these systems had served, but it did eliminate the cultural frameworks that had made these economic relationships meaningful and sustainable. The result was often economic instability and community poverty that persisted for generations. Legal conflicts emerged around property ownership, inheritance rights, and social obligations that had been defined by traditional religious frameworks. Spanish colonial law imposed European concepts of individual property ownership and legal responsibility that conflicted with indigenous social systems based on collective obligations and religious hierarchy. These legal contradictions created ongoing disputes that were difficult to resolve because they involved fundamentally different assumptions about social organization and individual rights. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clear when you consider how completely integrated the sacrifice system had been into indigenous psychological and social development. People who had grown up expecting that religious ceremonies would provide specific types of community support, emotional guidance, and cosmic reassurance couldn't simply switch to alternative systems that operated on completely different psychological principles. The result was often persistent feelings of spiritual emptiness and social disconnection that no amount of Christian education could adequately address. The educational challenges were particularly persistent because they involved not just teaching new information, but replacing entire frameworks for understanding reality. Indigenous children who were educated in Spanish colonial schools learned European concepts of science, religion, and social organization, but they also inherited psychological and cultural patterns from their families that were based on completely different assumptions about how the world worked. These internal contradictions created ongoing identity conflicts that affected multiple generations. Perhaps most significantly, the Spanish colonial system created social hierarchies based on racial and cultural categories that made full integration impossible for indigenous people, regardless of their level of cultural adaptation. Even indigenous people who completely embraced Christianity and Spanish cultural practices remained second-class citizens within colonial society, creating ongoing social tensions that contributed to persistent resistance movements and cultural preservation efforts. Compared to the conquest and colonization experiences of other indigenous civilizations, the destruction of the Aztec sacrifice system revealed both universal patterns and unique challenges that help illuminate the broader dynamics of cultural collision and adaptation. The elimination of indigenous religious practices was a common feature of European colonization throughout the Americas, but the Aztec case was unique in the degree to which religious and political systems had been integrated. Unlike many North American indigenous societies, where religious practices were embedded within relatively decentralized social structures, Aztec society had developed a centralized religious bureaucracy that made systematic destruction of traditional practices both easier to accomplish and more devastating in its effects. Comparison to the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire reveals interesting similarities and differences in how complex indigenous religious systems responded to European colonization. Both societies had developed sophisticated religious institutions that were closely integrated with political authority, but Inca religious practices focused more on ancestor worship and less on human sacrifice, making the transition to Christianity somewhat less psychologically traumatic for indigenous communities. The experience of Mayan communities during Spanish colonization provides another useful comparison point. Maya religious practices included human sacrifice, but were organized around more decentralized political structures that allowed some traditional practices to survive in remote areas where Spanish colonial control was less effective. The result was more successful preservation of indigenous cultural practices, but also more persistent conflict between traditional and colonial authorities. What was unique about the Aztec experience was the combination of highly sophisticated religious education systems with practices that Spanish authorities found particularly horrifying. The intellectual sophistication of Aztec priests made them valuable to Spanish colonizers as translators and administrators, but their expertise in human sacrifice made them particularly dangerous from Spanish perspectives. This created more complex relationships between colonizers and indigenous religious specialists than occurred in many other colonial situations. Universal patterns that appeared across different colonization experiences included the development of syncretic religious practices, the preservation of traditional knowledge through hidden educational networks, and the emergence of hybrid cultural identities that combined indigenous and European elements. These patterns suggest that cultural adaptation under colonial pressure follows predictable psychological and social processes, regardless of specific cultural contexts. The role of epidemic disease in destroying traditional religious institutions was also universal across colonial experiences. But the Aztec case was particularly dramatic because population loss was so severe that traditional religious practices became impossible to maintain, even in communities where Spanish authorities might have been willing to tolerate them. Lessons that could be learned from comparative analysis include recognition that the success of colonial cultural transformation depended heavily on the degree to which indigenous religious practices were integrated with political and economic systems. Societies with more decentralized religious institutions were generally more successful at preserving traditional practices, while societies with centralized religious bureaucracies experienced more complete cultural disruption. The comparative evidence also suggests that the psychological trauma of religious conversion was proportional to the degree to which traditional religious practices had provided essential social and psychological functions that colonial alternatives couldn't adequately replace. Communities that developed successful syncretic practices were generally those that found ways to preserve the psychological and social functions of traditional religion while adapting the surface practices to meet colonial requirements. By the late 1500s, warning signs pointed to the complete collapse of what remained of traditional Aztec religious practices. But these signs were often invisible to the Spanish authorities, who thought they had already successfully eliminated indigenous religion decades earlier. The reality was that underground networks of traditional practitioners had been gradually weakening for generations, and the final death of the sacrifice system was happening through slow, psychological and cultural exhaustion rather than dramatic confrontation. The most telling warning sign was the age gap that had developed among people who maintained traditional knowledge. The last generation of priests who had actually performed human sacrifice ceremonies before the conquest were dying of old age, and their knowledge was dying with them because the secretive conditions required for cultural preservation made comprehensive education impossible. Imagine trying to maintain a medical school where students could only learn anatomy through whispered conversations and could never actually practice surgery. The knowledge inevitably becomes incomplete and distorted over time. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the complex dynamics of cultural extinction. Spanish colonial authorities could see that public expressions of traditional religion had been eliminated, and they interpreted this as evidence of successful conversion to Christianity. What they missed was the psychological and spiritual emptiness that many indigenous people experienced within the colonial religious system, and the desperate ongoing searches for meaning that drove continued interest in traditional practices. Indigenous community leaders could see that younger generations were losing connection to traditional knowledge and practices, but they often missed how irreversible this cultural drift had become. They focused on preserving specific ceremonies and beliefs without recognizing that the social and economic context that had made those practices meaningful were permanently gone. It was like trying to preserve a language by teaching vocabulary words without recognizing that the entire cultural context that gave those words meaning had disappeared. The resistance to inevitable change took forms that were often more symbolic than practical. Elder indigenous leaders continued to teach traditional astronomical knowledge, ceremonial procedures, and religious concepts to young people who had no realistic opportunity to use this information in meaningful ways. These educational efforts provided psychological comfort to elders who felt responsible for cultural preservation, but they often created identity conflicts for young people who were caught between traditional knowledge they couldn't practice and colonial expectations they couldn't fully embrace. Perhaps most tragically, some indigenous communities developed what we might call cultural nostalgia syndrome, idealizing traditional practices that they remembered imperfectly and imagining that return to traditional ways of life was possible under circumstances that had permanently changed. This nostalgia often focused on the community solidarity and spiritual certainty that sacrifice ceremonies have provided, while forgetting the psychological trauma, social pressure, and constant fear that had also been part of the traditional system. The economic and political factors driving change were often invisible to people who were focused on religious and cultural issues. Spanish colonial policies were gradually eliminating the social structures that could support traditional religious specialists, the trade networks that had provided ceremonial materials, and the political autonomy that had allowed communities to make independent decisions about religious practices. These structural changes made traditional religious revival impossible, regardless of individual commitment or cultural knowledge. The final moments of the Aztec sacrifice system didn't come through dramatic confrontation or government decree. They came through the quiet death of the last person who remembered how the ceremonies were supposed to feel. Her name was Xochitl, and she died in 1604 in a small village outside what had been Teotihuacan, taking with her the final living memory of what it was like to participate in human sacrifice ceremonies as a genuine religious experience rather than a historical curiosity. Izil had been a young girl during the last public sacrifice ceremonies before the Spanish conquest, and she had spent the rest of her life carrying the psychological burden of being one of the few people who could remember the emotional and spiritual reality of traditional Aztec religion. By the time of her death, the indigenous communities around her had developed elaborate systems of cultural preservation that maintained the intellectual framework of traditional religion while completely lacking the emotional and spiritual context that had made those practices meaningful. Young people could recite traditional prayers, perform symbolic versions of ancient ceremonies, and explain the astronomical calculations that had guided sacrifice timing, but they did so as historical preservation rather than living religious experience. The specific events surrounding the end were less dramatic than anyone might have expected. There was no final secret ceremony, no last desperate attempt to perform traditional sacrifice, no dramatic confrontation between tradition and modernity. Instead, there was simply the gradual recognition among the few remaining traditional practitioners that the knowledge they had spent their lives preserving no longer connected to any meaningful religious experience. The final major players were primarily elderly indigenous people who had devoted their lives to cultural preservation, but who increasingly recognized that they were maintaining museum pieces rather than living traditions. These individuals faced the heartbreaking realization that their efforts to preserve traditional culture had succeeded in maintaining the form of traditional practices while completely losing the substance that had made those practices religiously and spiritually meaningful. The last attempts to preserve the system took increasingly desperate and ineffective forms. Some elders tried to perform simplified versions of traditional ceremonies using symbolic substitutes for human sacrifice. But these ceremonies felt hollow and meaningless to participants who could compare them to community memories of original practices. Others focused on teaching traditional knowledge to young people who had no cultural context for understanding why this information might be important or relevant to their lives. The dramatic final moments were internal and psychological, rather than external and visible. Individual indigenous people gradually stopped believing that traditional religious practices could provide meaningful spiritual guidance for dealing with colonial realities. Communities stopped expecting that traditional ceremonies could solve practical problems or provide emotional support during crises. Families stopped teaching traditional religious concepts to children who were being educated in Spanish colonial schools and preparing for lives in colonial society. Perhaps, most symbolically, the obsidian blades that had been the essential tools of sacrifice ceremonies were gradually repurposed for practical rather than religious uses. The descendants of master craftsmen like the original Itzel found themselves using their traditional skills to create tools for Spanish colonists rather than religious implements for indigenous ceremonies. The same techniques that had once created instruments for cosmic maintenance were being used to make mundane tools for everyday colonial life. The transition was so gradual that many people didn't recognize when it had been completed. There was no specific moment when someone declared that traditional Aztec religion was officially dead. No ceremony to mark the end of centuries of religious practice. No formal acknowledgement that a sophisticated religious system had permanently disappeared. Instead, there was simply the slow recognition that young people were no longer interested in learning traditional practices, that elders were no longer confident in the relevance of traditional knowledge, and that communities were no longer expecting traditional religion to provide solutions to contemporary problems. By 1610, the transformation was complete. Indigenous communities in central Mexico maintained some traditional cultural elements, languages, agricultural practices, family structures, and local governance systems, but the religious framework that had once integrated all these elements into a coherent worldview was gone. The sacrifice system that had once seemed essential for maintaining cosmic order had become a historical memory, preserved in Spanish colonial documents rather than a living religious tradition. The analysis of causes reveals that the Aztec sacrifice system died from a combination of external pressure and internal exhaustion that made its continuation impossible, regardless of individual commitment or cultural dedication. External pressures were the most obvious factors, beginning with Spanish military conquest that eliminated the political autonomy necessary for maintaining traditional religious institutions. The colonial legal system made human sacrifice a capital crime, ensuring that anyone attempting to continue traditional practices faced execution. The missionary efforts that provided alternative explanations for natural phenomena gradually undermined the intellectual foundations that had made sacrifice seem necessary and rational. But perhaps more devastating were the demographic impacts of epidemic diseases that killed so many indigenous people that traditional religious institutions couldn't function even if they had been legally permitted. The communities that might have supported traditional priests and ceremonial specialists were decimated by smallpox, typhus, and other European diseases, leaving insufficient population to maintain complex religious organizations. Internal problems had been building for generations before the Spanish conquest and contributed to the system's vulnerability to external pressure. The psychological demands on priests had been increasing as the empire expanded and ceremonial requirements multiplied, creating stress levels that were difficult to sustain long term. The economic costs of elaborate ceremonies had been straining community resources and creating social tensions that made the religious system less effective at maintaining social stability. The role of individuals versus historical forces creates complex questions about whether different choices might have always led to different outcomes. Some individual Spanish administrators and missionaries were more sympathetic to indigenous culture than others, and their policies influenced how traumatic the transition was for specific communities. Some indigenous leaders were more successful than others at negotiating adaptations that preserved some traditional elements within colonial constraints. but the larger historical forces, epidemic disease, technological advantages of European weapons and transportation, and the demographic and economic advantages that came from global trade networks, probably made some form of cultural transformation, inevitable regardless of individual choices and actions. What could have been done differently is a question that has occupied historians for centuries. Indigenous communities might have been more successful at preserving traditional practices if they had developed more decentralized and flexible religious institutions that were less vulnerable to systematic suppression. Spanish colonizers might have been more successful at creating stable colonial societies if they had been more tolerant of indigenous practices that didn't directly threaten colonial authority. But these alternative scenarios require assumptions about human psychology and cultural change that may not be realistic. The Spanish genuinely believed that human sacrifice was morally unacceptable and that eliminating it was a religious obligation, making tolerance of traditional practices psychologically difficult regardless of practical considerations. Indigenous communities genuinely believed that sacrifice was necessary for cosmic maintenance, making adaptation to colonial constraints extremely difficult without abandoning core religious beliefs. The question of inevitability versus contingency remains debated among historians. Some argue that the technological and demographic advantages of European colonization made the destruction of indigenous religious systems inevitable, regardless of specific policies or individual actions. Others contend that different approaches to cultural contact might have led to more successful adaptation and preservation of indigenous practices. The evidence suggests that some form of transformation was probably inevitable given the magnitude of the challenges involved, but that the specific form of transformation could have been less traumatic and destructive if both sides had been more flexible and creative in their approaches to cultural adaptation. The complete elimination of traditional practices wasn't necessarily inevitable, but it became increasingly likely as both sides developed rigid positions that made compromise and accommodation impossible. The immediate aftermath of the sacrifice system's complete disappearance was characterized by what anthropologists might recognize as cultural phantom limb syndrome. Communities continued to feel the absence of religious practices that had been central to their social and psychological functioning, but they no longer had access to the cultural tools that might have helped them adapt to this loss. The vacuum left by traditional religious institutions was filled by a patchwork of inadequate substitutes that satisfied neither indigenous psychological needs nor Spanish colonial expectations. Christian religious services provided some community gathering opportunities and spiritual guidance, but they operated on completely different psychological and social principles than traditional Aztec ceremonies. The result was often persistent feelings of spiritual emptiness and social disconnection that affected entire communities for generations. Indigenous people who stepped into this vacuum often found themselves in impossible positions that required them to serve simultaneously as cultural preservationists and colonial collaborators. Some became unofficial community historians who maintained knowledge about traditional practices without being able to practice them. Others became cultural translators who helped Spanish authorities understand indigenous communities while helping indigenous people navigate colonial requirements. The short-term consequences included widespread social and psychological problems that Spanish colonial authorities initially attributed to resistance to Christian conversion, but that were actually symptoms of cultural trauma and identity loss. Communities experienced increases in alcoholism, domestic violence, social conflict, and mental health problems that reflected the difficulty of adapting to life without familiar cultural frameworks for understanding and managing stress. Contemporary reactions varied dramatically depending on people's positions within colonial society. Spanish colonists often interpreted the disappearance of traditional practices as evidence of successful civilization and conversion, viewing the social problems that emerged as temporary adjustment difficulties that would resolve as indigenous. People became more fully integrated into colonial society. Indigenous communities often experienced the end of traditional practices as a form of collective bereavement that required mourning processes that had no precedent in their cultural experience. How do you grieve for the loss of religious practices that you still believe were necessary for cosmic maintenance, but that you can no longer perform without risking your life? Attempts at revival or continuation took forms that were often psychologically unsatisfying and culturally incomplete. Some communities developed symbolic versions of traditional ceremonies that maintained the form while eliminating the elements that Spanish authorities found objectionable. Others focused on preserving traditional knowledge through oral history and cultural education that prepared young people to understand their heritage without expecting them to practice traditional religion. The immediate legacy also included practical problems that had no obvious solutions. Communities that had relied on priests for medical care, educational services, astronomical knowledge, and administrative expertise found themselves without these essential services. The colonial system provided some alternatives, but they were often inadequate and culturally inappropriate for indigenous community needs. Perhaps most significantly, the immediate aftermath revealed how completely integrated the sacrifice system had been into every aspect of Aztec social organization. Eliminating religious practices didn't just change spiritual life. It disrupted legal systems, economic relationships, educational institutions, family structures, and community governance in ways that created ongoing problems that persisted for centuries after the original religious transformation. The legacy of Aztec human sacrifice shaped later developments in ways that went far beyond its immediate historical context, creating ripple effects that influenced European colonial policy, indigenous resistance movements, academic understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations, and modern debates about cultural relativism that is still playing out today. In the immediate aftermath of the conquest, Spanish chroniclers used detailed accounts of Aztec sacrifice practices as justification for European colonization throughout the Americas. The documentation of heart extraction ceremonies, skull racks, and ritual cannibalism became standard elements in Spanish propaganda designed to convince European audiences that indigenous Americans were savage devil worshippers who needed to be conquered and converted for their own good. This created a template for colonial justification that was applied to indigenous societies throughout North and South America, regardless of whether those societies actually practiced human sacrifice. The specific influences on later colonial policy were profound and long-lasting. Spanish colonial administrators developed legal and administrative frameworks based partly on their experience with Aztec religious institutions, creating policies designed to prevent the revival of human sacrifice that were applied to indigenous communities that had never practiced human sacrifice in the first place. The result was often unnecessarily harsh suppression of indigenous religious practices that posed no actual threat to colonial authority. How later generations viewed Aztec sacrifice reveals the evolution of European attitudes toward indigenous cultures and the development of modern anthropological understanding. 18th century Enlightenment thinkers used Aztec sacrifice as evidence for theories about the evolution of human civilization, arguing that indigenous Americans represented earlier stages of human development that Europeans had progressed beyond. 19th century Romantic writers romanticized Aztec sacrifice as evidence of indigenous spiritual authenticity that had been lost in modern European civilization. The myths versus realities that developed around Aztec sacrifice often said more about the people creating the myths than about the historical practices themselves. Spanish colonial accounts exaggerated the scale and brutality of sacrifice ceremonies for political purposes, creating distorted images that influenced popular understanding for centuries. Later European and American writers often romanticized or sensationalized Aztec practices for entertainment purposes, creating fictional portrayals that bore little resemblance to historical reality. Why? Aztec sacrifice remained important and historical memory when many other aspects of pre-Columbian civilization were forgotten reflects the psychological fascination that violent religious practices hold for people who live in societies where such practices are forbidden. The combination of sophisticated civilization with ritualized violence created a cognitive dissonance that made Aztec sacrifice particularly memorable and psychologically compelling for European and American audiences. The academic legacy influenced the development of anthropology, archaeology, and religious studies in ways that are still visible today. Early ethnographies used Aztec sacrifice as a case study for understanding the relationship between religion and violence in human societies. Archaeological investigations of Aztec sites were often motivated by sensationalist interest in sacrifice practices rather than genuine scientific curiosity about indigenous civilization. Modern archaeological discoveries have gradually corrected many historical misconceptions about Aztec sacrifice, revealing that the practices were more complex, less frequent, and more religiously meaningful than Spanish colonial accounts suggested. These discoveries have contributed to broader academic discussions about the reliability of colonial historical sources and the importance of indigenous perspectives in understanding pre-Columbian history. The legacy also includes ongoing political and cultural impacts on modern Mexican national identity. The image of Aztec sacrifice has been used by different political movements to support various arguments about Mexican history, indigenous rights, and cultural authenticity. Some Mexican intellectuals have embraced Aztec heritage as evidence of sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization, while others have distanced themselves from sacrifice practices that they consider embarrassing or primitive. Perhaps most significantly, the historical impact includes the development of modern concepts of human rights and cultural relativism that emerged partly from European attempts to understand and evaluate indigenous practices like human sacrifice. The moral questions raised by Aztec sacrifice contributed to philosophical debates about universal versus culturally specific moral standards that continue to influence international law, anthropological ethics, and cross-cultural understanding today. Today, we can see echoes of the Aztec sacrifice system in contemporary institutions and practices that might seem completely unrelated, but actually share remarkably similar psychological and social dynamics, revealing that some aspects of human nature and social organization remain constant across cultures and centuries. The most obvious parallel exists in modern military and security institutions that require individuals to perform psychologically traumatic tasks while maintaining professional competence and emotional stability. Modern soldiers, police officers, and security personnel often face psychological challenges similar to those experienced by Aztec priests. They must be trained to use violence effectively when necessary, while maintaining moral principles and community support, and they must develop psychological mechanisms for coping with the trauma of regularly witnessing or participating in activities that will be deeply disturbing in civilian contexts. Modern surgical medicine provides another striking parallel to Aztec sacrifice practices. Contemporary surgeons must develop the same combination of technical precision, emotional detachment, and psychological resilience that Aztec priests required for heart extraction procedures. The training processes are remarkably similar: years of intensive education, gradual exposure to increasingly traumatic procedures, development of professional communities that provide emotional support, and maintenance of spiritual or philosophical frameworks that give meaning to activities that involve cutting into human bodies. The psychological conditioning required for modern emergency medical work mirrors many aspects of Aztec priestly training. Emergency room doctors, paramedics, and trauma specialists must develop the ability to remain calm and focused while dealing with human suffering, maintain technical competence under extreme pressure, and process the emotional impact of regularly witnessing death and injury. The support systems that modern medical institutions provide for dealing with these psychological challenges are remarkably similar to the meditation practices, community support, and spiritual frameworks that Aztec priests used for managing the trauma of their work. Modern professional athletics provide examples of how contemporary societies create elaborate rituals around competitive activities that serve some of the same social functions that sacrifice ceremonies served in Aztec communities. Major sporting events involve months of preparation, elaborate ceremonial elements, community gathering and bonding, and the symbolic representation of larger social conflicts through individual competition. The psychological investment that modern communities make in sporting events often resembles the emotional intensity that Aztec communities brought to religious ceremonies. Corporate and institutional cultures often develop practices that require individuals to perform psychologically difficult tasks while maintaining loyalty to organizational goals and professional standards. Modern business executives who must make decisions that result in layoffs, military commanders who must order actions that will result in casualties, and government officials who must implement policies that will harm some citizens while benefiting others face psychological challenges that echo those experienced by Aztec priests who had to balance individual compassion with perceived cosmic necessity. The patterns of specialization and professionalization that characterize modern complex societies are remarkably similar to the organizational structures that developed around Aztec sacrifice practices. Contemporary institutions create specialized roles that require extensive training, develop professional communities that provide support and validation, and maintain elaborate protocols designed to ensure consistent performance of complex procedures. The psychological mechanisms that modern professionals use for managing the stress and responsibility of specialized work are often similar to those developed by Aztec priests. What hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency for individuals and communities to develop elaborate justifications for practices that serve perceived social needs, even when those practices involve actions that contradict basic moral intuitions. Modern societies create institutional frameworks that allow people to participate in activities from military combat to corporate downsizing to environmental destruction that they might find morally problematic in other contexts. Similar patterns appear in different contexts when societies face challenges that require individuals to perform difficult or traumatic tasks for perceived community benefit. The development of professional specialization, psychological conditioning techniques, community support systems, and moral justification frameworks follows remarkably consistent patterns across different cultures and time periods. The lessons for contemporary issues include recognition that complex social problems often require institutional solutions that acknowledge the psychological and social realities of human behavior rather than simply assuming that moral exhortation or legal prohibition will be sufficient. The Aztec experience suggests that sustainable solutions to social challenges must address the underlying human needs that problematic practices serve, rather than simply eliminating the practices without providing alternative ways of meeting those needs. Even now, the Aztec sacrifice system influences contemporary academic study, popular culture, political discourse, and social movements in ways that reveal how historical practices continue to shape modern understanding of religion, violence, culture, and human nature. Academic study of Aztec sacrifice has become a crucial case study in anthropological discussions about cultural relativism and moral evaluation of historical practices. University courses in anthropology, religious studies, and Latin American history use Aztec sacrifice as a way of exploring questions about whether universal moral standards exist or whether all moral judgments are culturally specific. These academic discussions influence how students understand cross-cultural ethics, historical interpretation, and contemporary human rights issues. Archaeological research continues to reveal new information about Aztec sacrifice practices that corrects historical misconceptions and provides more nuanced understanding of their religious and social significance. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed evidence about the frequency, methods, and cultural contexts of sacrifice that was unavailable to earlier researchers, contributing to ongoing scholarly debates about the nature and meaning of these practices. Popular culture representations of Aztec sacrifice in movies, television shows, video games, and novels often perpetuate historical misconceptions while also reflecting contemporary anxieties about violence, religion, and cultural difference. These popular representations influence public understanding of pre-Columbian history and shape contemporary attitudes toward indigenous cultures and colonial history. Political discourse around indigenous rights, cultural preservation, and historical justice often references Aztec sacrifice as either evidence of indigenous cultural sophistication or justification for European colonization, depending on the political perspective being advanced. These discussions influence contemporary debates about reparations, cultural autonomy, and government policies toward indigenous communities. Social movements focused on decolonization and indigenous rights must navigate the complex legacy of practices like human sacrifice that were part of traditional cultures, but that conflict with contemporary human rights principles. The challenge of honoring indigenous heritage while rejecting practices that modern societies consider unacceptable reflects broader tensions about cultural authenticity and moral progress. Why people still care about Aztec sacrifice reflects ongoing human fascination with the relationship between religion and violence, the psychology of belief systems that justify extreme actions, and the moral questions raised by cultural practices that seem simultaneously sophisticated and barbaric. The continuing interest also reflects contemporary concerns about religious extremism, institutional violence, and the role of ritual in maintaining social cohesion. The influence extends to modern discussions about medical ethics, military conduct, and institutional responsibility that draw on historical examples like Aztec sacrifice to explore questions about individual moral responsibility within institutional contexts that require or encourage morally problematic actions. The story of Aztec priests and human sacrifice remains relevant today because it illuminates fundamental questions about human psychology, social organization, and moral reasoning that every complex society must address in some form. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Aztec priests to perform human sacrifice while maintaining genuine religious conviction and personal morality are not unique to pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. They represent universal human capabilities for cognitive compartmentalization, moral justification, and social conformity that appear in every society and every historical period. Understanding how these mechanisms operated in Aztec culture provides insights into how they operate in contemporary contexts where people are expected to perform psychologically difficult tasks for a perceived social benefit. The organizational challenges involved in managing complex institutions that require specialized training, professional competence, and psychological resilience are similar across different cultures and time periods. The solutions that Aztec society developed for training professionals, managing institutional stress, and maintaining social support for difficult work provide examples that are relevant for contemporary institutions facing similar challenges. The moral questions raised by Aztec sacrifice practices about cultural relativism, universal human rights, individual responsibility within institutional contexts, and the relationship between religious belief and ethical behavior are questions that modern societies continue to grapple with in different forms. The Aztec experience provides a case study for exploring these questions without the political sensitivities that surround contemporary examples. The process of cultural transformation and adaptation that followed the Spanish conquest provides insights into how societies respond to fundamental challenges to their worldviews and institutions. The psychological and social dynamics involved in cultural change, resistance, and adaptation are relevant for understanding how contemporary societies respond to globalization, technological change, and cultural contact. The historical impact of Aztec sacrifice on colonial justification, academic understanding, and popular culture reveals how historical practices continue to influence contemporary attitudes and policies in ways that are often invisible to people living within those influenced systems. Recognizing these ongoing influences is important for understanding how historical narratives shape contemporary social and political relationships. Perhaps most importantly, the story illustrates the human capacity for both incredible sophistication and moral blindness, revealing how intelligent, educated, and well-intentioned people can participate in systems that cause enormous harm, while genuinely believing they are serving important social and spiritual purposes. This insight is relevant for understanding not just historical societies, but also contemporary institutions and practices that may appear obviously problematic to future observers, but that seem reasonable or necessary to current participants. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've discovered about the human complexity behind Aztec sacrifice. The story of two obsidian blades that were created in 1518 by the master craftsman Itzel, whose workshop we visited earlier in our journey. The first blade was crafted for a major solar ceremony honoring Huitzilopochtli, requiring months of preparation, ritual purification, and spiritual conditioning that represented the pinnacle of Aztec religious craftsmanship. Itzel spent weeks selecting the perfect obsidian core, carefully removing flakes to create an edge sharper than modern surgical steel, and performing the prayers and offerings required to make the blade spiritually appropriate for its cosmic purpose. The finished product was a work of art that combined technical mastery with religious devotion in ways that modern observers can appreciate even while rejecting its intended use. The ceremony for which this blade was created took place just months before Spanish ships appeared on the horizon. The priest who used it, let's call him Nikali, after our earlier character, performed the hard extraction with the precision and spiritual focus that represented decades of training and psychological conditioning. For Nikali, using Itzel's blade to offer a human heart to ensure the sun's continued rising was the most meaningful and important action he could possibly perform, combining his professional expertise with his religious devotion in service of what he genuinely believed was cosmic necessity. The second blade was created just 2 years later, in 1520, when the Spanish conquest was already underway, but the outcome was still uncertain. Itzel found himself working under completely different circumstances. His workshop was now supervised by Spanish authorities. His traditional purification rituals were forbidden, and the blade he was creating would be used not for religious ceremony, but as evidence in Spanish legal proceedings designed to document the barbarity of indigenous practices. This second blade was technically identical to the first. The same obsidian quality, the same precision craftsmanship, the same razor-sharp edge that could slice through human tissue without resistance. but everything about its creation and purpose was different. Idzil crafted it without religious preparation, without spiritual meaning, and without the community context that had made his work personally fulfilling and socially important. The blade became a museum piece before it was ever used, representing a religious practice that was already becoming historical memory rather than living tradition. The contrast between these two identical tools reveals everything about how meaning and context shape human experience. The first blade was part of a religious system that provided psychological satisfaction, community identity, and cosmic purpose to everyone involved in its creation and use. The second blade was an artifact of a destroyed culture, created to satisfy colonial administrative requirements rather than spiritual needs. But perhaps most poignantly, both blades ended up serving the same ultimate function. They became historical, evidence that helps modern people understand the complexity of human nature and social organization. The first blade, preserved in Spanish colonial records, provides insight into the sophistication and spiritual meaning of Aztec religious practices. The second blade, created under colonial supervision, provides insight into the cultural destruction and psychological trauma that resulted from the collision between incompatible worldviews. The story of these two blades encapsulates the broader themes of our entire journey: the human capacity for creating meaning and purpose within institutional frameworks that may seem inexplicable to outsiders, the role of context and community in shaping individual experience, and the ways that historical practices continue to provide insights into contemporary questions about morality, psychology, and social organization. What this story reveals about everything we've discussed is that human beings are capable of both incredible sophistication and moral blindness, often simultaneously, and that understanding historical practices requires appreciating both their internal logic and their external consequences. The candles are burning low now, and the shadows in the room have grown longer and softer, wrapping around us like a gentle reminder that every story eventually finds its way to a quiet ending. We've traveled together through centuries of human experience, visiting temple pyramids and training schools, witnessing elaborate ceremonies and quiet deaths, exploring the minds of people whose worldview was so different from ours that understanding them required stretching our imagination in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable, but always illuminating. If you're feeling a little emotionally exhausted by this journey, that's perfectly normal. We've been exploring some of the most psychologically complex territory in human history, trying to understand how intelligent, compassionate people could participate in practices that seem unthinkable to us, while also recognizing that our own descendants might someday look at our institutions with similar bewilderment and moral concern. The stories we've shared tonight, from Tlacalal's political maneuvering to Itzil's blade craftsmanship, from Nakali's ceremonial breakdown to Yodel's psychological trauma, from the elaborate training schools to the quiet village where the last memories died, all remind us that human beings are capable of creating meaning and purpose within any circumstances. No matter how challenging or morally complex those circumstances might appear to outside observers, there's something both humbling and comforting about recognizing that the psychological mechanisms that allowed Aztec priests to function within their system, professional specialization, community support, moral justification, and institutional loyalty, are the same mechanisms that allow people in every society to perform difficult work and maintain social stability under challenging conditions. We're not so different from them, and they weren't so different from us. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of obsidian blades and pyramid temples, of earnest young students learning impossible skills, of craftsmen creating beautiful tools for purposes they never questioned, of communities gathering for ceremonies that provided meaning and connection despite their tragic cost. Or perhaps you'll simply rest in the quiet knowledge that human beings have always found ways to create order, meaning, and community within whatever circumstances they've faced. The universe continues to spin without our conscious effort. The sun rises each morning without requiring ritual encouragement, and we can rest peacefully knowing that some problems really have been solved. Some institutions really have evolved beyond their original limitations, and some forms of human suffering really have been left behind in the past where they belong. Sleep well, wherever you are.